So, hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi. So what frustrates me most about the graphic design industry is actually the lack of criticism. So lack of voice, lack of responsibility to each other and the world in our industry, vocally and out there, in whether it's in a publication or I can't speak for stuff that happens behind the scenes, but vocally, it's not really an industry that does it. All the other arts have critics and that are very critical of the industry and keep it accountable. So, as a discipline that aims to contribute to public debate and contribute to public life in such a big way, we do an awful little amount of debating and critiquing. Perhaps we never did, or perhaps we've stopped. Design blogs not really a source of debate either. They're kind of infectious PR spin, as I see a lot of them. So, what are your thoughts on the lack of graphic design criticism?
I think that's a really fair and recognisable appraisal. And actually, I think it's one of the reasons why I was pulled towards education, because it felt like a different type of space where you could, well, actually just part of what we do day to day is critiquing what the discipline is and also trying to develop approaches and curriculum and content which will generate critical debate among students and hopefully develop critical faculties so that you will take that out into the industry too. I think there are some there've been attempts to try to introduce more criticism, and I'm not really sure why those have failed in terms of somehow having a kind of changing how we get seen as a discipline. And there are a few things. So I think one of the things for me, and you might recognise this from being in education, that there seems to be a kind of hierarchy in terms of creative disciplines, and if fine art or architecture, which as disciplines both have extremely developed critical discourse around the subject, they would be at the top, and then I think you start to get down going lower to graphic design somewhere near the bottom because of our relationship to industry, because of the idea that somehow graphic designers are, well, we're a service industry, we provide a service. And I think the exciting thing about how the world is changing and how therefore our discipline is changing in relation to society, technology, economics, politics, is that everything's up for grabs again, and actually we're not just a mouthpiece for somebody else's views or to sell a product without engaging in what our responsibilities are. So there's something around kind of the history of our discipline, its newness and its relationship to commerce and capitalism, I think. And perhaps on the whole, I don't meet a lot of graphic designers who want to be really critical. That there's an area, there are certainly parts of the industry where the creative buzz and the excitement and the motivation is around solving a client's brief really effectively, and the idea that you might be critiquing or really seriously questioning what and why and how and who for, all those questions around graphic design is not in everybody's mindset actually, and that's really disappointing because it feels like that's where as a discipline we need to get to have a greater role in how the world works. So again, it's this thing about graphic design historically being thought of as the discipline that makes other people's messages look a certain way, that it comes at the end of a process. And hopefully the briefs that you all engage in here and the culture on the course at CSM is opening up this idea that actually, as graphic communication designers, you should have a seat at the table at the start of projects, that the way in which disciplines work together and the expertise that you as a graphic communication designer bring in relation to whether it's a client or whether it's thinking of the projects that we do with external clients or with local community groups, they bring their expertise, but instead of there being a hierarchy, it's about saying, right, how do we explore this together? And I think I agree with the criticism that does exist around talking about graphic design as problem solving. I think it is about identifying problems, and increasingly it's about coming up with better questions, not necessarily solutions, and opening up debate and making things accessible and meaningful. But I think it's a really, it's not an unknown, or it's not a completely. That's fun, right to say this. It's a question that people ask: Why do we lack this? This sense of critical rigor, and I just don't think there's a single answer. But I do think there's more. That there are individuals. So there are design journalists, and there are individuals within design and certain practitioners who I think. Actually, Jonathan Barnbrook would be somebody who I'd say, through his work, which is commercial but political, and has a really strong Jonathan has a really strong way, I think, of articulating what he does and why he does it. And he absolutely has edges that he's very happy to articulate about things he wouldn't do. And he also talks really brilliantly about what happens when his work hits the public, how non-designers and how audience respond, and what that means for him as a designer. And so people like that feel like, to me, are embracing. I don't know. They're realists as well. They're idealists and realists about what graphic design and graphic communication design can be.
I think others that I've interviewed, not to name any names or anything, but they've quoted something like, my focus is largely with the idea that as an industry leader, right?
Yeah.
You have the power or the influence, potential influence, to go out and write an op-ed somewhere, right?
Yeah.
They will actually, big companies and big newspapers will listen to you if you come out and say it. And others some have said, yes, there's like the idea that it's not everyone's priority. Okay, fair enough. And others said, there's a money thing in it, like it's not really what you want to do at the end of a long day, or like all those sort of natural things, something we can all be lazy. And then there's others who are saying that, well, some of these design blogs, they're accountable to the design, and designers accountable to the design blog. But I find that sometimes as a sort of, and as the longer I thought about it, yes, I can see that for a small studio. But if you're, not to name like these big British brands we have here, or like some of the American ones, are you really accountable to, like, if It's Nice That or The Guardian write like a critical piece about your design? Like, to an extent maybe, but your reputation kind of precedes itself at this point. So is it, and then it's also, I wonder, why does and then It's Nice That as well, it's also so massive that does it really matter if they write, well, was the new redesign of Slack a bit too not brave enough, right? Was it, you just kind of redid some stuff? Is that where we wanted to go? Like, not criticizing it, but sort of writing that critical thought on it. And I just don't understand why it's not done. Like, I find the answers a bit sort of like, it's an easy, sometimes the excuses are there, but it doesn't feel like the real reason at times.
I think graphic designers are guilty of slapping each other on the back too much. And actually, when Lucienne Roberts, who I co-founded Graphic Design Am with, when we were first talking about what we wanted to do, we saw that there was a real gap in the publishing market, which was graphic designers making graphic design books that were for non-graphic designers, and that weren't just beautiful books that other graphic designers would kind of drool over. And I think It's Nice That has so much of the drooling over pieces of work, and there's a place for that, don't get me wrong. And actually, Will and Alex, who founded It's Nice That, I think have done an amazing thing for broadening exposure, particularly of young designers and designers outside of those kind of main big companies who, when I was a graphic design student, you really had to search out the work of up and coming creative practitioners or people from different countries or
Yeah.
parts of the world, and I think it's nice that do that. But the clue's in their name. They're not setting themselves up to be critical.
No,
They're called It's Nice That.
I just wonder if, as like, you know, big companies, as they get bigger, their responsibilities also do change to some degree.
Yeah,
like,
no, I agree.
And I think it's sort of revaluing.
I agree. And
do we want to have like a design observer kind of part of it? I mean, it'd be like one piece a day or 2 pieces a week or something. Like, it'd just be a welcome sort of change to have. They don't have to criticize young people. I mean,
no,
that,
exactly,
right?
exactly.
But there's still a chance to sort of say, is this thing that Pentagram is doing? Is this thing that Wolf Olin is doing? Is this thing that North is doing? Is this thing that Design Studio is doing? Is that really where we want the industry to go? Or is that more service to this part or something?
I think there's a real place for that. And actually, Design Observer, I think, is one of the few places where I feel like there is real rigour, and there's also a good level of debate, and the podcasts are interesting where they're conversational. But I do feel we're too self-congratulatory, and also I think it is laziness, actually, the fact that we're not prepared to kind of look ourselves in the mirror and talk really honestly about that. But what was the other thing I was going to say then? Yeah, the other thing that I've always had a problem with is the way in which, through competitions and conferences, on the whole, graphic design and advertising are guilty of privileging recognisable and kind of already high-profile designers or design studios, and that we've not been nearly as brave or disruptive as I think your generation, but also just more broadly younger people would not only want but would respond to. And I think there's still too many. There's too much of the male pale stale at the top of graphic design, and they're the people who still not entirely. There's some really notable exceptions of mostly small movements led by individuals who are motivated to set up different types of event and discussion. But if you look at, I think D&AD is still kind of institutionalised in a way that feels, to me, slightly depressing. They do some great stuff in the education area, but there's still a sense in which we haven't moved far enough. And if you look at who the faces and voices are that represent the industry in some of these high-profile public forums, they don't represent what I see as an educator at all, and they haven't done for the last kind of 5-10 years.
I think you actually answered the question I had, which was topics you wish the graphic design community would discuss openly.
Okay.
So you kind of already.
Yeah, well, I absolutely think we should. I think we should be talking about. I think we should be much more open and critical about how unrepresentative the graphic design industry is, particularly at its top level, and when we are the producers.
I can count how many people of colour I've seen in the studios I've been to interview on one hand.
I know, and actually,
I'm one of them.
And gender for a long time has been up there.
Gender's not so big now.
It's not so big. It still is at the top, but it's not the thing. I mean, people are comfortable talking about gender now. Talking about diversity beyond that, and that's really. That says a lot about how lazy and culpable the industry is in not promoting change. I feel that really strongly. I also think there's not enough, we don't talk enough about the responsibility and the opportunity in being graphic communication designers. So I think the way in which the decisions that we make, so in the Hope to Nope Graphics and Politics show that graphic designer and co-curator at the Design Museum recently, we quote a US designer called Mike Montero, he said design is always political. And I can send you the quote so you've got the direct quote, but to paraphrase him, he basically says that in designing, as the designer, every piece of design is for somebody and excludes somebody.
Yeah.
That actually by promoting a certain product or a certain brand or providing a certain service, we should be asking not just who's this for, but who does it exclude, who's it not for. And I think that I really like to see graphic design talking about that more, because that's where change will come from. And I just wish, to be honest, I wish that younger designers have more. It's like the world at the moment. There's a generational failing.
Yeah.
The generations who are holding power and influence, let's face it, we've got it wrong. It's not working.
Yeah.
I wish there was more of a sense of us flipping.
As the retirement age gets bigger, the problems get bigger as well.
Absolutely. And actually, in the public sector,
I don't know
you
if
can't.
that's true. I'm just saying that.
No, but in the public sector, you can't. It's down to an individual whether they retire or not. You can't say you're at retirement age, you should retire. And actually, there is a point there. Where do we make room for this?
Yeah.
And how do we get enough change? And I think Lucy and I talk about this. We're actually working on a Brexit-related project at the moment. And we talk about the fact that we think change will only happen when all of you who've been so disenfranchised by politics end up being the ones with the power.
When I'm 50.
I hope it's before then.
No,
I'm dead by then.
Well, probably not.
Maybe not.
Can Graphic Design Save Your Life? Is an exhibition that demonstrates how graphic design affects what we notice, what we understand, and the actions we take, and the essential role of design profession. And the essential role design profession plays in matters of life and death. So, why did you want to create this exhibition in the first place?
So when Lucy and I set out with graphic design, and the idea behind it was that people don't talk enough about what graphic design is in relation to other subjects.
Yeah.
So we weren't very interested in just talking about graphics, and we felt that was being done, but we were really interested in the role that it plays and the value that it adds in relation at the service of other disciplines. And we'd done a book on graphic design and literature, which was a kind of experiment in how graphic design gives voice to the text that we read. So taking the first page of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, giving it to 70 designers to lay out as they wanted, to show how typography and layout are influential, but often not invisible, but perhaps not recognised by non-designers as being quite as powerful at manipulating and influencing things as they might think. And we'd done a maths book where we'd looked at communicating, asking graphic communication designers and illustrators to communicate the golden section, so a kind of ancient Greek formula for beauty, through their work across 2 double-page spreads of a book. And what was great about that is we know that schools use it as a way of kind of opening up a subject which is traditionally quite, maths can be quite a complex topic, and so it's great to think that the book it's a kind of educational tool. And we've done a couple of other projects, and we had an idea for a long time that we'd be interested in graphic design and health. And we went to Wellcome Collection and said, graphic design and health, we'd love to do something. And we went with the idea of a book, and they quite quickly said, well, we've got an archive here that we'd love to show, so perhaps there's an opportunity to do an exhibition and not just think about this as a publication. And over the period of a year, it went from being a discussion about a kind of a temporary travelling exhibition that we might do that was quite small, to Wellcome getting very excited and saying, this is an exhibition we want to house here. And for us, I think that the moment that everything clicked into place was when we came up with that title, because we we really wanted to make this accessible and inviting to non-designers, and the way to do that was to make this a participatory exhibition, in the sense of asking a question and asking people to come along and make their own mind up. And I think we both felt really motivated by the fact that, from how a pill packet communicates effectively and safely how you take a medicine, to the livery on ambulances that mean that it's visible in traffic and from the air, and coded. There's a coding system in terms of emergency services with the Battenberg pattern they have, to signage in the hospital, to health tests and how service design is being used, to public health campaigns. So, for instance, the Don't Die of Ignorance HIV and AIDS campaign in the UK back in the late 80s. And it felt like such a rich topic, and it felt like a great way of demonstrating that graphic design isn't always about selling things, and of saying that in the end, in order to stay healthy, we have to have effective communication. And communication's often, we all know that communication is part of how the world functions, but I don't think we often pause to scrutinise what that means in terms of visual communication. And if you think of public health campaigns would be nothing if nobody got the message. And how does that message get out? It gets out because graphic designers help, and they don't work alone. So the title was provocative, because graphic designers on their own, of course, don't save lives, but they do when they're partnered and working with other organisations. And without it, there's certainly an opportunity for there to be, at best, a lack of effective communication, but at worst, mislabeling. So interestingly, there's still a really shockingly high proportion of hospital deaths are due to wrong dosages of drugs being administered, and that is largely to do with how the labelling systems work. So it becomes it was such a fascinating area for us.
Cool. And also you encouraged all of us graphic science students here to go, and probably others as well. So not in talking about the general public, you already touched on it. So what did you hope that we would take away, and anything, maybe something in terms of how we'd formulate our practice, or like what was the hope? What was the hope in really urging us to go?
I think it was just. Well, there were two things actually. One is it was on our doorstep, so it was really easy. It's walking distance from here, so it was a kind of get out there and have a look at what's down there. But also, one of the things that we worked really hard to do in the curation was to show some historical examples. So we included Florence Nightingale's cholera mapping of, not cholera, that was John Snow, sorry, Florence Nightingale in her the Crimea War did these amazing charts which visualised post-conflict death among soldiers who were being treated in the hospitals, field hospitals in Crimea. And that visualisation helped change health policy in this country, because what it helped show was that most of their soldiers were dying from secondary infections because the sanitation was so poor. They weren't dying from their initial injury. So to show a kind of, to place in our discipline in history, but then also to show just the sheer range of ways in which graphic design is affecting how we all stay healthy. Felt quite an idealistic thing to say you should all go and see it, but it also felt like it's actually quite an affirming thing to see examples of work which we don't often bring into the curriculum, and that were kind of, I hoped, it absolutely wasn't saying you should all be going and doing this, and that wouldn't be appropriate, but it was saying be aware of this work that's out there, And we'd worked really hard to get examples from around the world, to have some, of course, famous graphic designers and well-known pieces of work, but also some really experimental and young designers in there, people whose work probably isn't high profile. So it felt like an opportunity to get students along. And of course, as idealists, we want young graphic designers to think, I can use my talents to do this, but it doesn't mean that and not commercial work.
Yeah.
It just means that, look, this is the power, and actually the positive impact that as a discipline we have. I do think sometimes it's possible to take quite a negative view of the impact of graphic design. We produce, if you look at the First Things First manifesto, nothing's really changed. We still do a lot of design
Someone
that
revised it
serves.
recently, and it's
Yeah,
basically the same
precisely,
thing.
and it's the same. But that's not the whole story. It's one story. So I think to add this to the story of what graphic design is felt like a really valid thing to be doing.
Let's skip this question. All right. So I think maybe if for this one, this can be a long question, but to keep, maybe you could just try to list some other things.
Yeah.
So what are graphic communication designers' responsibility to each other and to the world?
That's a really big question.
There you go.
But it's a really good question. So one of the responsibilities that graphic designers have to each other and the world is to ask questions, and to
But behind closed doors in public?
no, in every context, not just to take assumption or make assumptions rather, and take things at face value. I think whether it's answering a brief where you're looking for real insight and you're looking for something which is a particular angle or a particular kind of way into a subject or a project brief, you need to ask questions. But also, going back to our earlier conversation, it's about asking questions of each other, and we shouldn't take offence at questions that get asked, and we shouldn't be defensive. Like, actually, the openness of the discipline should be something that we are proud of and that we make much more of a feature of. That we're good question askers, actually. That is what a lot of designers have in common. That you don't just look at something, you say, what is this? Why is it here? What does it have to do? How does it do it? Who does it benefit? What's the environmental impact? So all of those questions are things that we should be asking. I definitely think graphic designers should be both more critical in relation to one another, but also supportive. So I still think there's an element of competition which can be problematic. I'd like
Chris Moody say we all compete, but we all play football, and we should stand up for what football does, right?
Yeah. But actually, there is something interesting, because I think there is something around gender within graphic design that I remember when Lucy and I wrote a book interviewing graphic designers about their creative process. It was amazing how many of the male designers commissioned one another via the football pitch, as in they socialised together. And I think one of the issues around graphic design in relation to gender is there's still a kind of macho culture around the working culture, which means that if you have a family, if you have caring responsibilities, you potentially have a different kind of status. You have a different access to those networks, and I don't, I'm not naive. That happens in every walk of life, but I think how graphic designers support one another more. The key to that is how we support people who aren't like us, whoever that is. But going back to the diversity thing and the generational thing, a lot of that should be about graphic designers talking more and listening more to young designers. Absolutely. And then in relation to the world, I think think a really important thing is how we collaborate, actually. I think how we reach out and work with other disciplines is kind of the key. So that feels to me an important responsibility that graphic design education has in terms of starting to broaden or develop the skill set, which is about working with one another, listening to other people, and understanding that it doesn't always have to be about you, because I think ego is quite a big problem in a lot of our industry. And in the end, it is only graphic design. You know, the kind of thing of we aren't brain surgeons, and that's the ego needs to recognise in some way that we're interdependent. We depend upon people requiring our services, but also we should be able to work in different ways with people and collaborate beyond just the people who want to sell things and have big pockets. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. There's so many things that could go in here, but
probably get two points there.
Yeah.
I think we have a bit of time. So you said this very eye-opening thing, I think, last year when I forgot what her name is now. The visiting
Kelly,
the one from Rhode Island. When she was here, and you were talking about, because you just touched on it earlier. How there was some crazy statistic. Maybe you can say it again. How when black people are in education, the amount of people get firsts of those percentage-wise is like 25%, was it? And then, so what was the statistic between blacks and whites?
So I can send you the most recent data. So what happens at a local level? Universities, and then within universities like UAL, colleges, programs, and then courses scrutinise the data around what we're doing, and we live in a data obsessed age, so we get a lot of data, and yet the data that is a priority because of how shaming it is around what is known as the attainment differential. So an attainment means students who get a first or 2-1, and in the UK, almost unanimously across the sector, if you're, and the acronym is BAME, which again it's a really it feels in itself a problem that we have to name in this particular way, but that stands for Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, Black and Minority Ethnic. Even, you see, we use the acronym so often I don't even know exactly what it stands for. And BAME students at UK universities are significantly less likely to achieve a first or 2-1. Now, the shocking thing is that in the last 10 years that data's barely changed, and that to me is it's super shocking that exists, but people have been trying to do something about it. It hasn't worked. So what is going on there?
So my question regarding it was, I mean, there's of course, like, you could talk, I mean, there is obviously one of these, classic wicked problems that you guys mentioned to us, but there's this sort of idea that I have that there's only, for example, you're a program coordinator, right? You can't influence what happens necessarily prior to what they're in here, right? So if someone has a background plays a huge influence in education. It does that all across the world. I'm very familiar in Denmark, that where I come from, attainment levels are much higher than like 2 counties down, basically, due to wealth, right? And the same with all universities and high schools. It's very easy. Mind plays a big part of it, and where you come from. But so when we're in here, right? For example, there's 3 black boys in my course, and there's
in my year,
and there's 30 men or something. And there's not that many, but let's say we're here, right? What is the effort to push the minority ethnics, the Asians, the blacks, to get high attainment levels? What's the effort, and what can be done within?
It's a really good question. So these are things that, as you say, we recognise as a wicked are wicked problems, i.e. they're not solvable through a single thing. But we can do things, and we should be doing things to try to work out, at the very least, what it is that we might be doing or not doing that reinforce that and are preventing it. And I must just say, one of the things that we've been looking at this really closely over the last 18 months, 2 years, and actually we've closed the gap quite significantly on this programme, but our overseas student differential has grown. So now on GCD here, the really scary statistic is that if you're an international student joining this course, you're significantly less likely, by a much higher percentage than if you're a BAME student. So that poses lots of questions for us. So one of the things that there are a few things that we've seen as priorities. So one of the first things is that we have to look at what a staff team, what unconscious bias might be at play, because it would be irresponsible not to look at that. So that involves at UAL online training and sessions with outside experts who come in to get us talking about fairness, equality, and to really question our own use of language and assumptions. So that's key. So there's actually, as a staff team, who we are, how we think, how we act, what we say, and what impact that has. As part of that, there's also the fact that we don't have enough people on our staff team who look like our students, and I mean that in every sense. So we don't have representation. We're not a solely white team, but we're pretty much Western, and we have good male-female mix, but really that's where you kind of stop. So we know that we have to get a better representation across our staff team. So actually working with graduate teaching assistants, so our graduates, has been a really important way of us saying, let's get a better range of voices in, and let's really kind of proactively have people who work closely with students who there's a better relationship with, in terms of people looking like and having experiences which are similar. There's the diversification of our reading lists and our resources that we've been really guilty of referencing and making reference to work that sits in a kind of Western canon that has not acknowledged the really rich range of influences and also impact of non-Western work, which also feels really important. And then I guess the other piece of work that we're really interested in is how we try, and this is just looking at the grade attainment of students, so not looking at whether they're BAME, overseas, European, home, with a disability, without a disability, taking all of that out, but just saying, okay, when we get to certain points in an academic year, we should be looking at those students who are looking as if they're the C-D students, and we should be trying to intervene in terms of identifying with that group, right, what do we need to do to shift these students, because it looks like that's something that could have quite an impact. So and I guess the other things to support that we're doing is, in third year, the Wednesday sessions where workshops kind of happen as part of NOIA, and it will build during this term as well, is responding to some of the things as tutors that we're noticing could do with supporting more. Sometimes that's around production skills, sometimes that's around particular kind of discipline expertise. So we're looking at maybe bringing in design strategists to work with a small group of students, and none of that would be compulsory, but it's based on us looking at all of the feedback sheets that staff across 150 students, and looking at those students where we think the trajectory is not what we'd be expecting at this point, and saying, okay, let's look at the shape of their assessment criteria and where they're falling, where are the strengths. And actually what we're spotting is that by third year, mostly students are pretty good on analysis and really confident in research, but some of that realisation is where the problems come in. So okay, what can we bring in? So some of what we're doing is not identifying students by anything other than their attainment and looking at that. So we're doing a whole range of things, and the thing that we have to do is we have to measure it. So each time a unit finishes and that data takes a little while to get into the system, we then as a team sit down and we look at each of the units and we look at what the data is telling us, and we have to try and work out whether that data is indicating problems in terms of what we're delivering and how we're delivering it, whether it's showing some kind of development.
Could you not get former BME students
During
those meetings?
Well, actually, and the next stage is, so
it's very easy to, I mean, for anyone, I'm not pointing blame, but it's very easy to have a conversation about, oh, this is the reason, or this is what we think it is. And then as soon as this person's actually that person, they come and be like,
no, absolutely,
no, that's not the problem, actually.
It's absolutely. But also, I think one of the dangers is that we've become really aware of it is it's really, those broad generalizations are really problematic as well, so that you're right, talking to students, you learn much more. And I think this is particularly the case with international students. Being an international student from Norway compared to China, compared to America, that's wildly different in terms of what that means for them coming to the UK, and especially if you've studied in the UK before. And there are these broad generalisations that almost can be used as an excuse not to go much deeper than that. And actually there are people like Anushka from last year who did her major project around the lack of women of colour in graphic design, and some of the work that she's been doing and the conversations that she had with staff absolutely had an impact on the things that we were talking about and thinking about doing. But it's a work in progress. It's a real work in progress.
I was thinking that in terms of that, I think there's of course a responsibility for educators to get high attainment level for those who are disenfranchised for whatever reason. But what really, I think it has to be a necessary push, because I think you cannot change what happens prior, but the fact that I could go to these studios and I was like the only person in the room who was of color. I mean, of course there are others.
No, but you're right. It's
but with Orleans, I saw like one person, and he was actually from here. And I think and my
really
girlfriend
stark.
says, "Oh, do you know that black graphic designer?" I'm like, "Yeah, Eddie O'Para," because there's one.
Yeah, I know.
And so and I think with anything like what we see in cinema, if you have a role model, it very easily changes it. So it has to be sort of I don't know how to solve this problem. I'm just saying it must be one of the missions.
At UAL, there are two programs that exist, which I think are really positive. So there's a local college version and there's a UAL version, but they're funded programs to support. At CSM, it's particularly our graduates of colour who want to teach, to learn about teaching and to come in and teach and get experience as a programme, which means that it's a really it's a funded and supported process, in recognition that the way that we change the face of the profession is that we say we have to do it. It's not happening without us proactively doing it, so we have to be doing that, and we have to do that in terms of teaching. It's a harder thing in terms of industry. Industry's really, and in fact we've got a couple of positions that will come up in the coming year on this programme, and I've been talking to my dean. We've been saying we need to make sure these are positions that attract a really diverse field. And I was saying in graphic design it's really, really hard for anybody to say I can name 10 designers or practitioners that we would want to be applying, because they're not the profile.
So it has to be the push now to like.
It has to be the push now. It has to be our grads. Yeah, absolutely. And I think and that's that can be a bit. That can feel like it's just too slow, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And I do believe in tipping points. I mean, I do believe that there are certain things that happen, and actually in Canada there's been quite an interesting thing out OCAD. I can't remember which the City OCAD's in off the top of my head. Again, I can find that out. But they've been doing cluster hires of first generation now what they're native Canadians, but they First Nation lecturers, as a way of saying, actually, we can't, it becomes tokenistic if what we say is we must be diverse and we must have a First Nation lecturer. So they made a really bold move in saying we need to do a cluster hire here. We need there to be visibility that happens. And so they looked at that as an institute, they managed to do it, to achieve it, and it's had a really direct impact really quickly.
Yeah.
Because there's visibility, but you make it happen. You make it happen through some quite tough decisions, and by kind of in a way legislating for it, saying this has to happen. It's not down to chance or option. This is what we do. So it'd be really interesting to see if that kind of thing starts happening here, because there's lots of discussion about it.
I had one more question.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is a bad question to ask now, but maybe
Okay.
it is. Debating a bit. I'm going to ask this one. It's controversial, but because the other one I think you've already answered in other ways. But so, what frustrates you most about graphic design students?
About graphic design students. Okay.
And that you're such a positive person, so I want to ask you that question.
I'm a positive person,
so
but I
you
tell you, okay. What?
I won't take offense.
No, there are a couple of things, and I think one of the things that is really frustrating is that I think that what this course is and does sets you all up. There are gaps, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. We've still got a lot to do.
Don't worry,
but I think
one's going to see this.
but I think it sets students up in a really distinct and great way for a sustained practice in the future. But what really frustrates me is, I think, by encouraging our students to be critical, the way in which students are critical of the course means that I and some of the team are constantly fighting a battle to say to the university why we're good, because our data doesn't necessarily say it. So that's a frustration, because, but it's also the flip side is we're super proud of having really critical students. But of course, that means you're critical of us, and that is a real frustration. It's a frustration in my position because it means that I'm having to.
Values and we then
of course. But then we look at the National Student Survey and we look like we're one of the weakest courses in the country because students are so critical, and you feel like, we're not going to change how we teach in order to get good survey results. But that's a frustration. I think the other frustration for me would be that there is so much on offer here. So this is, again, quite a local thing, and I think not enough students make the most of it. And I think, in an idealistic way, sometimes what can frustrate me about some graphic design students, not just here, but I external examine, I do things everywhere, it's totally understandable, but in a way that undervaluing what you bring and what your influence can be. Because it is true that the older you get, the more that you realise that actually you've all got such a lot to bring, and that the lack of confidence, of course, entering a world which is it's completely different to education in so many ways. But I think it's really frustrating to see students not value their own skills and their own contribution enough. But it's also totally understandable, and it's a pretty difficult thing to shift, because I think a lot of that recognition comes further down the line when you look back and go, okay,
Changed.
So they're my frustrations.
Cool. Thank you.